The People's Republic of China was proclaimed in fall 1949. 32 years prior, the Bolsheviks took over a Russian government and established a communist state as well. Few months after 1945, few months after proclamation of China's People's Republic of China, the new state entered into formal alliance with the Soviet Union. Mao Zedong is the chief architect of Chinese communism. What Lenin, then later Stalin, meant for the Soviet communism, that is what Mao Zedong means for Chinese communism. Since the peasants, Chinese peasants, made up approximately 90% of population in 1940s, Mao concluded that the only way to bring communism to China was to rely on the revolutionary peasantry. Why is this important to know? According to World Bank, almost 20% of Chinese population lived in urban areas in 1980, which is about 40 years ago. In 2019, according to World Bank, the number of urban population rose to 60%. Why is this important? Because urban population is consumer population. Peasant population always, all through centuries, was kept and it lived at the subsistence level. Consumer population produces or triggers or creates a strong economy. Strong economy and wealth translates into military power. Just keep that in mind. In the first 3 years of governing, Mao's regime expropriated the land from the landlords, who were either killed or imprisoned. The land was first redistributed to peasants, but then within about 5 years, from 1955 to 57, it was collectivized in a very similar process as the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union have done. Initially in the Soviet Union, the land was taken away from nobility, distributed to the peasants, and then collectivized in around 1930. This happened most likely because many peasants welcomed, the resistance in the rural area was not as fierce as it was in the Soviet Union. This is most likely because many peasants welcomed Mao's regime and because in Chinese tradition, the central government in Beijing is always considered authoritative. The new communal way of life, became a basis of Chinese peasant life. The communes soon proved to be inefficient and disastrous. One factor is that communes were usually about 25,000 persons. That's like a large, small town, difficult to manage. And keep in mind that people who were appointed to manage communes were always, appointment was based on the participation belonging to the party rather to qualifications and ability to manage. During the first decade, Mao's government, the Soviet model was the blueprint of Chinese economy. In 1953, Stalin died, That's March 5th, 1953. In that year, Mao introduced the first 5-year plan. It was successful, like in the Soviet Union, the first 5-year plan actually was achieved in 4 years. Now, first 5-year plans are usually successful for the simple reason they are starting from scratch. By 1956, Nikita Khrushchev established himself in power in the Soviet Union, and at the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, on February 25, 1956, in a secret speech to the Congress, Khrushchev denounced and condemned Stalin's policies and Stalin's, quote, crimes. That secret speech, in a very short time, somehow was made available to the West, and it became public. Khrushchev's criticism of Stalin and his harsh policies did not sit well with Mao. Because Mao pretty much followed Stalin's pattern of behavior and Stalin's policies. But Mao also believed that he, as a senior communist leader, and he perceived himself being senior to Khrushchev, he believed that the mantle of Lenin-Stalin should somehow be passed unto him. So there was some personal jealousy on his part. At the same time, Mao was becoming impatient with the Soviet model, and in 1958, he introduced the so-called Great Leap Forward policy. It is an accelerated version of the 5-year plan. It was an attempt of massive and overnight industrialization. The endeavor was costly and failed miserably. His mentors in Moscow criticized him, and in the meantime, Khrushchev's secret public speech became also perceived by many, and Mao was afraid of that, a criticism of his policies. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, where the Soviets were forced to cave in face of the American resolve to stop the Soviets installing nuclear heads in Cuba. Mao was interested, and he wanted to see a clash between the Soviets and the Americans, because he was way more revolutionary, and his revolutionary zeal was much stronger than what was actually happening in Moscow. He derided the Moscow leadership's fear of, quote, paper tigers. In the years to come, Mao began to believe that the Soviet revolution has been suffocated by bureaucratization. And he decided that he would not allow the same to take place in China. He began to notice how his own communist comrades were gradually settling into their own respective careers and positions, and he feared that they would soon lose the revolutionary zeal. That's pretty much the same feeling what Stalin sensed in the early 1930s, and eventually led to the great purges in Soviet Union. As he was preparing, Mao also feared that possible rivals may appear within the party. As he was preparing to somehow rejuvenate the party with a renewed revolutionary zeal, he found out that Beijing, which is kind of has that traditional respectability on the part of the population at large, that somehow Beijing is controlled by the inside adversaries. And he eventually turns to his supporters in the second largest city of China, Shanghai. In 1964, he wrote the following, quote, "We cannot take the old path of technical development followed by various countries of the world and go at a crawl after other people. We must break with the convention and make maximum use of advanced techniques so that our country can be built into a modern socialist power within not too long and a historical period." That is the same sentiment that Stalin in the late 1920s told his people, that and I'm paraphrasing, we are approximately 100 years behind the West, and we must make it in 10. How do you do that? In 1965, Mao made a call for a cultural revolution. In May 1966, helped with a small group of his young and radical supporters, the newly formed, he created, with his leadership, they created a small number of people, a cultural revolution group. And that group was about 15, 20 individuals. And what is very interesting, that one of those 15, 20 individuals was his own second wife, Jiang Jing, and some other revolutionaries. Notice that Mao turns to younger generation. Again, very similar pattern that Stalin did as well. Stalin also turned to the younger generation to replace the old generation, the old Bolsheviks, because Stalin believed that only with those Bolsheviks, those communists, those members of the Communist Party who were born after 1917, or let's say born maybe a few years earlier, but they grew up during the Civil War, Russian Civil War and after, not older generation who already lived and experienced and had some sense of pre-1917 society. The Cultural Revolution was an officially inspired anarchy for all practical purposes. Professors were publicly humiliated. Learned doctors, physicians, they were made to scrub the floors of their own hospitals. Scholars were abused for having foreign language books in their private libraries. Communist Party secretaries were accused of sabotage. Factional fighting of all kinds was allowed and encouraged, sometimes even in the streets. The economy again suffered. Managers and skilled personnel were sent to the village to learn lessons of the revolution. They were forced to sweep barns, to dig potatoes. The only qualification for promotion was to memorize the thoughts of Chairman Mao, which are immortalized in the little red book that they used to wave and so on. You probably saw that in the images on TV. By 1969, the anarchy was so bad that Mao had to call back the Red Guards, and that those are the youthful groups, something like militia, and put the army in charge of everyday affairs. The Cultural Revolution was a huge setback for China. And it had similar effects that had been felt for at least a generation, as it was the case with the Great Purges from 1934 to 1938 in the Soviet Union. In point of fact, Mao's behavior in many ways followed the pattern of Stalin. And Chinese political party pretty much kind of followed what was happening in the Soviet Union before. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, the year of the proclamation of the communist state in China versus communist state in Russia is about 32 years. It's about a whole generation. And that's also important to keep in mind when we talk about our present situation, what's going on here. You'll see why. The Cultural Revolution was actually, in point in fact, it's Mao's way of trying to survive politically, as Stalin used the Great Purges to do the same. Ironically, the same thing happens after Stalin's death. Khrushchev and the communists, the entire party, pretty much distanced themselves from Stalin, and Khrushchev in his secret speech condemned Stalin, Stalin's policies, and Stalin's crimes. Ironically, the same thing happens to Mao and the Cultural Revolution after his death. Within weeks of Mao's death, September 9, 1976, his ambitious and hated wife and her three close associates, members of that the revolution, Great Revolution, Cultural Revolution group of this, they also were, and matter of fact, his wife and three associates, they were referred to in our media as the Gang of Four. They were imprisoned, and eventually the new generation, post-Mao generation, began to rehabilitate all those individuals, party members who were falsely accused, sent to prison, and so on. Now, a similar case when we talk about great cultural revolution in China, we have similar things happening during the so-called war communism in the Soviet Union. War communism lasted between 1918 and 1921. At the same time, the civil war in Russia between the Red Army forces, the Bolsheviks, and on the other side, the so-called White Armies, collection of monarchists, Republicans, Democrats, pro-Westerners, and so at the same time as the Civil War was going on, war communism was being implemented. And then during the 1930s, the same thing was going. In order to achieve their objectives, Stalin and Mao as well, they were willing to sacrifice and literally destroy millions of human beings just to achieve their objective and to survive politically and to preserve their communist regime. Now, what is very interesting to me as I am observing this whole situation, what is going on today with us, it is interesting that Chinese communism or Chinese communist state was about a generation later than the Soviet communist system or communist state. And eventually the Soviet communist state collapsed in 1991. The Chinese communist state still exists. And when we speak of the Cold War, and if you bring that topic, the audience immediately thinks about the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Supposedly that Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But all throughout that period, and it is considered that Cold War started approximately 1943, 1945, during the closing years of the Second World War. And ever since then, American policies were the policies of strategic containment of Soviet communism and, I assume, the Soviet state, the expansion of the Soviet state, or the influence of the Soviet state. It's interesting that even in 1993, the Vatican leadership was willing and actually made a concordat with Nazi Germany in 1933. The Vatican was willing to make an agreement with Nazi Germany in order to somehow combat Soviet or Moscow communism. And that fear of Moscow communism was actually, they would rather, the Vatican would rather, and at that time Cardinal Pacelli was Secretary of State who actually signed its agreement. So the Vatican leadership was willing rather to make an alliance with the Nazis in order to fight the Bolsheviks, because the Bolsheviks were perceived as the worst enemy of the Catholic Church and by extension of Christianity. That hatred and resistance to the Soviet Union is still translating even today into relationship vis-a-vis United States relationship with Russia, which is a state which inherited legal rights of the Soviet Union, but drastically changed from what it used to be. Russia today is not a communist state. All those communist leaders, somehow by miracle, in the late 1980s and 1990s became Westerners and believers and so on. They became capitalists, took over economy and so on. It is interesting to keep that in mind. And also in the 1970s, we have one big event taking place, which is only now beginning to take importance, and that is when in February 1972, American President Richard Nixon made a visit to China. And that visit is now beginning to show somehow ramifications for all these years. And what is interesting to me to watch is that our government has made peace with China. But China also changed drastically after Mao's death, because it stopped seemingly, apparently, it stopped the state-controlled economy and adopted something like Western free market economy, but it is still controlled by the state, by the party. And what's interesting to me is that reapproachment was somehow taken as China is our friend. And for the years, as time was passing by, yes, many American corporations and companies made a lot of money with that relationship. Because when China eventually becomes part of the World Trade Organization in 2001, and when China opened up in the 70s and especially in the 80s to welcome Western capitalism, China was warehouse of cheap labor. The Soviet Union, Russia was not that. And 2001, by now, Chinese population is, as I mentioned before, 60% urban. It is the second largest, if not approaching to become the largest economy in the world. Second largest to the United States. Some people even argue that it's probably right there on par, and who knows, if it were not for this pandemic, maybe it would surpass the US economy in the near future. And what I see is that 2016 election brought in a populist man into the government. Trump was a disruptor of that whole course that was going on for a number of decades. And I think that now, if we keep in mind that after all, God is in charge, and according to Paul, God establishes, or not establish, God lets people be a government. What kind of governments He lets it go. He uses those people and so on. So what happened with Trump was, from the very beginning, my position was that he's an outsider. He will not last long because the system was too big and too strong. And he had to go. For 4 years, they tried to get rid of him, and eventually he is defeated. Now, what does that all mean for us and our religious freedom? In my classes, as I teach world history, my survey courses, I always point out to my students that when the founding fathers in the 18th century established this particular republic, and the way they structured the government, it is not popular democracy, it is a democratic republic, where the rule of law rules, and where majority governs, but the rights of minorities are protected by the structure of the government. In other words, the majority may not come up with laws which will be curtailing the basic rights of the minority. And when I tell my students, when you look at the long history of humanity, no other country has come up with such a form of government. It was the best human beings could develop and come up Now what we are witnessing is that very structure of the government is being attacked, and some people promise to take it apart. And the fundamental principle of all freedoms that were proposed and propagated and talked about and fought for, and people died for it during the Enlightenment age, 16th, 17th, 18th century, is the freedom, not only freedom to assemble, freedom to publish, freedom to to assemble, to publish, and the most important is freedom of conscience and freedom, religious freedom. That's the most important, religious freedom. To believe, to live according to your conscience. To believe whatever you want to believe, and to be protected, that people have no right, the state has no right to restrict that freedom and to force you into behaving in the way that you believe you should not, or you should, and so on. And that freedom is being, it publicly has been stated already, has been stated this morning by Conrad Wine, that some people have already pointed out that we cannot use religion to excuse ourselves from, quote, discriminating against certain groups of people. Another important event that we should take place, that we should keep in mind, is I am also surprised to see that that same Vatican, which was dead opposed to Soviet communism, is today welcoming Chinese communism, willing to work and cooperate together. My closing thoughts are, as we are witnessing this, and I don't know, much of this talk may give us problems in the days to come. Persecution, we Adventists talk about persecution to come. Persecution is already here. Are you aware of that? We are already being persecuted. Or not you and I, but persecution is already taking place. There is already calls by the people that will be in the government in few days to, and not only by the government people, but even by other agencies, to ostracize, to marginalize, to debar, to certain individuals, and actually a war is going on to completely destroy what we call those who are connected or are conservatives. In my opinion, is that Christians who are not Seventh-day Adventists, they also have to go through persecutions. At every step in our lives, we have to make a choice. Are you going to go this way or that way? And many of conservatives out there will eventually have to make those choices. We Adventists, along the way, will also become part of that persecuted group, but we are going to be persecuted to the end. And it will be more fierce and fierce, and probably in the end, the Sabbath issue will become the defining factor. The last choice, you go this way or that way. So, it is somewhat, what is happening is somewhat frightening. It is somewhat alarming, but we should not take, when we speak of these things, we should not take this as trying to instill fear in us, because turning to God out of fear is questionable. That you should not fear God. We should take it more as a warning, or maybe just this is descriptive. This is what's happening in society. Matter of fact, it may be strange to say, but I'm somewhat glad that this is happening. It's about time. We talk about it, and one leading line of Lenin was, in his days, because Lenin kind of rejected one aspect of Marx. Marx believed that capitalism has to ripen, capitalism has to die in order for the proletariat to come out. Lenin said, well, since proletarian revolution is inevitable, that's the key term, inevitable. Then he said, why wait? Let's do it now. Push history a little bit. Since the second coming is inevitable, why are we so afraid of these things? I mean, it has to come, let it come. It's going to be tough and difficult and painful, but what else can we do? But now, in this situation, as we are being persecuted, I think it is very important for us to begin to think, how are we thinking of those who persecute us? How do we speak of them? How do we treat them? Are you willing to say like Jesus, and some martyrs of the past have prayed and say, God, help them, they don't know what they're doing. How do we position ourselves in a situation when we find some of our Christian friends who are not Seventh-day Adventists and they are persecuted? What do we say about them, to them? How do we see ourselves? And so on. Because these are the issues that are very important. Can I have 5 minutes more? Maybe 6, 7, 10. I would like to add to something, Conrad, you spoke about. You mentioned and spoke a little bit about totalitarian regimes. Because I teach about these totalitarian regimes in the past and all of that. Over the years, I had come up with a number of characteristics of a totalitarian regime. Because in order for a state to be, or society to become totalitarian, it needs to have certain things set in place in order to achieve that. Because it's not easy to control entire society in totality. That's very difficult. And what state needs is technology. During the Middle Ages, the church attempted to control population. It could not. It did as much as it could, but it could not because lack of technology. Hitler, Stalin, they tried also to control population in total. What we mean by that is that no aspect of your existence, of your life, is free from the control of the state. That's what it means. You are controlled totally. But Hitler and Stalin did not have technology we have today. It is technology which enables people in power to control the population in total. So there is always a degree, to what degree a state can control the population. Now, there are a number of things that must be. And I'm going to skip number one, and that I usually have it on my list here, and I'll bring it up later. Number two, one single political party. There has to be one political party. Now, that doesn't have to be, because totalitarian regimes do not copy each other through history. There are always changes and so on. So, for example, I don't believe that Nazi Germany type totalitarian regimes or Stalin communist totalitarian regime will replicate itself. Exactly, no. But a lot of things will change, but things will. So we may have two-party system in this country, but one party can easily be kind of neutralized. And there's a possibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there is a possibility. Big possibility that we can become one party, with one party irrelevant. One official ideology. It doesn't have to be the state ideology. It can be cultural, social, the masses. Look what happened just in the last few weeks. We have CEOs of few corporations, companies, who are virtually shutting us down. What you may say and what you may know, and what you may read. Don't be fooled. We don't use the word propaganda. We have different terms for that. Management of information. And that's happening in our country too. Complete control of judicial system. Everyone is under suspicion. State police. Monopoly over education, educational system. We still have private education, but even private education is heavily monitored by accreditation agencies. Monopoly over the communication system, well, that's what we see going on today. Monopoly over arms and weapons. That's a really touchy feature. What is very much embedded in American culture, which goes back to the 18th century, is the freedom to own arms and weapons. And this is where there will be a big struggle between the government, how to neutralize that, how to take that. And that to me is interesting to watch what will happen and how it will develop in the years to come. No other Western state has this, that citizens are allowed to, go and buy guns and arms and so on. Monopoly over economy, or just think about what we have here about climate change, climate crisis. That's not just to, let's say, clean up the air and so on. It is also controlling commerce, several industries, transport industry, commerce, oil industry, and energy, and all of that. That's slowly overtaking economy. Individual rights are subordinated to the needs of the state. The rights of individuals, and this is one of the major features of the Enlightenment age, which is, I also believe, biblical principle. Right of individuals are extremely important. Even God deals with each one of us individually. The fact that you belong to a church, an organization, institution, or any group doesn't save you. You stand before God as well as I stand before God as an individual. And when it comes to this, that those rights are subordinated to the needs of the state, that's another feature, characteristic. And then you have this social and private issues are simplified. And listen, when you listen to politicians like to simplify things in order to make slogans. And people fall for it. Well, my friends, life is way more complex. Issues in our society are very complex. And then, not only that they are simplified, but they are politicized. For example, sexuality is a private issue, but it has become politicized. Religion is a private issue, but it will be politicized, and it is already being politicized slowly. And then the first one, which is probably the most, the bottom fundamental principle of totalitarian regimes is Conrad, you were this morning just about to use that phrase, and you did not. So you saved my day. And that is the principle of the end justifies the means. That's what the young generation today, I want to have that. I hear that even from small children today, 4, 7, 8 years, my grandchildren often. I want that. Just because I want it. I'm not surprised more and more when I ask my students, if you are in a situation where you have to decide what's right and wrong, on what basis, how do you decide? Do you know what is the most common answer I get? Well, if it feels good. Can you imagine that? If it feels good, it's right. Since when feelings make a decision? Decide. Since when feelings are deciding factors? Do you know how troublesome that is? If you happen in life, and sometimes we do, what I need to achieve, whatever I do, is justified by that. This principle, the end justifies the mean, is satanic principle. It's not biblical principle. And so when you listen and observe what is happening, keep in mind some of these things, how more and more our society is showing these features, which tells me that right now we are in a very serious point. To a large degree, we are just about to cross that critical point, and we could be referred to as a totalitarian state. What is encouraging is that I find that interestingly that a considerable number of states throughout the world are stunned by the developments in our own country. So where is that idea of the city and the hill? The light that is supposed to shine. We, United States, are supposed to be a country that is desirable to go to. Now people will say, wait a minute, what's happening here? So, The times are serious, but the Lord is coming. Thank you.